topic is necesidades nutrimentales y prácticas de alimentación para el destete y crecimiento éxitos. It's a very general talk about feeding. The specifics on problems with under and overnutrition and DOD will be covered in detail by other presenters. So I don't want to steal their thunder by going into too much detail here. Further, there are many different types of feedstuffs used in feeding horses, depending on what part of the world the horses are located. And it's not possible to address the specifics of these either at this time. So I will be discussing a little bit about growth and the requirements of growth, how we fuel growth, and some nutritional factors that affect growth. I'll be touching briefly on a comparison on weaning methods and then on feeding the weanling, yearling, and 2-year-old. The equine industry differs from other production animals in that we aren't producing these animals for a specific product like meat or milk or fiber. We're producing athletes, and we want them to live soundly for as long as possible. Because high growth rates can provoke problems, we need them to grow at a steady rate instead. So with equine, our biggest concern for young growing horses is sound, healthy growth. Few horses are as precocious as the horse. As you see, within 20 minutes of birth, the foal can stand, and within hours, they're running at speeds faster than any human athlete could ever achieve. Growth is something horses do well. There is extreme rapid growth in the beginning. And so by 6 months, they are around 80% of their mature height and 50% of their mature weight. With horses, we're looking for optimal, not maximal growth. With optimal growth being here in the in between slow and fast growth on a scale of a few to many problems, we can see that as the growth rate increases, so do the risk of having more problems like developmental orthopedic diseases. And then on the other end of this graph, we see that the slower the growth rate, the more problems we see with weak, undergrown foals. Within 1 year, a foal can reach 90% of its adult height. One of the things that we have to be aware of is that the adult size of a horse is genetically predetermined. You can push the horse to grow faster so he will reach that potential earlier, but he will not end up any bigger than his genetic potential predetermines. Another thing is if the horse is not provided enough energy, it may not reach its genetic potential. Beyond genetics, growth rate and maximum height can be influenced by environment, nutrition, and management. So for example, horses tend to be smaller in environments that require more energy, such as cold climates or very, very hot climates. They also, in places where energenic feeds are not available, like here in Virginia, we have the Chincoteague ponies. They tend to be much smaller. And they get bigger when the industry supports bigger sales prices for larger individuals. So foals can grow at different rates. Of course, there's always the genetic potential that we have little control over, especially in individuals predisposed for rapid growth. Sometimes it's the breeder's goal for the horses that dictates how fast they push it to grow. If the breeder needs an individual to be nearly full grown for yearling or 2-year-old sales, then the individual may be pushed to reach that goal. It's our responsibility to recognize when an individual is growing too fast for its own good and adjust the diet accordingly. We need to see a smooth growth curve and not one with deviations of slowing and then compensatory growth spurts because that's an invitation for problems. It may mean feeding a slower growth rate, but that doesn't mean to starve the foal nutritionally. It's important that even if trying to slow the growth rate of an individual, that all of its requirements for the other nutrients besides energy are being met. In certain industries, the goal of the breeder is to get the largest possible individual to sales by the time they are yearlings or 2-year-olds. And we know that steady, slow growth is important for skeletal soundness. So monitoring the individual and comparing its growth rate with the average growth rate can help a breeder to possibly head off some developmental problems from occurring. And for this we have developed a software program called GrowTrack that is available to breeders to watch and maintain and control the growth of their young horses. KR has been studying growth for over 30 years and has a tremendous database with over 40,000 records of individuals collected from all over the world. The resulting curves are compiled as reference curves for breeders to compare their individuals to the averages of horses in their part of the world. We have developed a software program where breeders can enter growth data and look how it compares with growth curves and percentiles and quartiles. So an example of this would be this growth curve from an individual, which is here in the green, with weights taking it at different periods, like once a month, basically. And then it's compared to the average growth curve here in the orange that's been made up of the thousands of data points that we have in our database. So here a breeder could see that this yearling was starting to grow too fast, and then maybe at this point they have maybe made some changes in the diet to slow the growth down so that he gets back on track to something more normal. This program also gives us percentiles within quartiles. In this example of this horse, we see that this foal is in the 4th quartile for weight, which means that he's heavier than between 75 and 100% of the other foals in the database. But he's only in the 3rd quartile for height, putting him between 50 and 75% of all other foals for height. This just gives you an idea that being a heavy foal for his height may put him, you might want to be watching him because it puts him at risk for problems. Along with making sure the young horse is meeting its requirements for nutrients and energy, it's also very important to keep an eye on the body condition of the growing horse. If they're too thin, it would be an indication that they may not be getting enough energy. And if they're too fat, then it could be detrimental to the skeletal development because of the excess pressure from carrying too much weight. You can generally use these adult body condition score descriptions here in this chart for yearlings and up. It's not quite as accurate for weanlings, because one thing to keep in mind with weanlings is that they tend to carry their fat higher up on the top line, and then as they age, it migrates over and down over the ribs. This body condition score chart is available from the KR website for free at this above address. So ribs, seeing a few ribs on a young horse is not really that bad, since they carry most of their fat up here on the top line. So I'd rather see a few ribs than have a foal that's so fat that it does start to affect them metabolically and skeletally. Horses will put available energy first into growing bones and lastly to adipose tissue. It's more important that they have the building blocks of quality protein and adequate amounts of minerals and vitamins for sound skeletal growth than looking glossy and round. So why is nutrition important in growth? We're growing future equine athletes. that need to be sound to perform. And when we grow our horses optimally, we aim to achieve a perfect balance between nutrition and body weight gain, so that the skeleton has the best chance of growing as strong as possible. The nutritional building blocks of growth are limiting to each other. A foal will not grow if it does not have enough energy. That energy will support growth. The energy would be supplied by carbohydrates and fat in the diet. Now, if there's adequate energy, then there needs to be enough protein, or more specifically, the essential amino acids, to support sound growth of that skeleton with these limited building blocks. And if there's enough energy and protein, then there also needs to be several minerals and vitamins that play a role in sound skeletal connective tissue and muscle growth to produce the desired sound growth. Sound growth is a balancing act of energy on one side with protein and vitamins and minerals on the other. For everything to work well together to promote sound growth, there can't be too much of one and too little of the other. If protein and vitamins and minerals are not in adequate supply, then all of the energy in the world would not produce sound growth, and vice versa. To illustrate this concept, I picked out two studies. The first one was done in Texas with yearling quarter horses who were fed one of two isocaloric diets, either alfalfa hay with oats or alfalfa hay with a fortified grain mix. The horses receiving the blended grain grew taller, while the horses on the oats didn't grow as tall, but only got fatter. The authors concluded that when energy is provided for growth, but is not fortified with the proper amino acids, vitamins, and minerals to support healthy growth, the calories are converted to fat instead of developing muscle and bone. In a study done during my PhD, where I had two groups of foals on high quality bluegrass and clover pastures, and then supplemented them with alfalfa grass hay mix in the winter. One group was given a fortified grain concentrate formulated specifically for growing horses. And then the others were only on the pasture and the hay. So these diets might not have been actually isocaloric, but it would all depend on how much of the grass those weanlings on the pasture and hay only foals were consuming. What I found was that the growth rates and height were similar for the two groups, but the supplemented foals weighed more. So the interesting thing was that the pasture and hay only group were more susceptible to respiratory illnesses. So we concluded that when growing horses are provided adequate calories and protein for growth, but not fortified with proper minerals and vitamins to support healthy growth, the calories are used for fueling skeletal development, and then muscle, and lastly, body condition and immune function. While the horse will achieve its adult height within 2 to 3 years, they do not achieve maximum bone mineral content until they're about 6 years old. The bone mineral content progresses rapidly in the first year from 17% at birth to 68.5% at 6 months and 76% at the end of the first year. The body of the growing horse prioritizes where the nutrients are used, and we see that most of the energy goes to growing those long bones once the maintenance requirements are fulfilled. The chronological order of skeletal development of the horse starts with the growing in the limbs, starting with the hoofs, and then the head and neck, as well as the fetlocks, then expanding to the chest, then lengthening the trunk and widening the ribs, and finally lengthening the croup. Growing horses need higher amounts of many of the nutrients and energy than adult maintenance horses. The National Research Council has collected the information from research in growing horses and come up with recommendations for many of the nutrients needed by the horse. I've pulled a few of them out from the book and put them here in this table to illustrate the differences. The advisors felt that requirements were different enough for the various ages of growing horses to have recommendations for each of them. They divided the recommendations as follows into 4, 6, 12, 18 months and 24 months, and as well as 18 and 24 months for work. You can see that even though the average daily gain is going down as the horse grows, the total megacals of energy continues to go up as the horse increases in size, and then obviously with work. Protein as well increases, and along with lysine. Minerals and vitamins increase as the horse increases in size, but the authors did not feel that there was any increase in recommendation as they were put into work. These recommendations are the basis used by equine nutritionists to formulate rations and balanced diets for growing horses. So looking a little more closely at the requirements, we see that the energy requirement of the growing horse is the maintenance requirement plus additional amounts to support growth. These energy requirements are determined by body weight, average daily gain, body composition, and utilization rate for building body tissues. The ideal is to provide energy and nutrients to fuel a moderate and consistent growth. And you can see this by monitoring growth rates monthly. If the foal is growing too fast, then adjustments to the calories in the diet need to be made, and the reverse. If the foal is growing too slow, then the amount of energy in the diet needs to increase. Keep in mind that when increasing calories, the other nutrients should be increased as well for balanced growth. Energy requirements aren't just dependent on the individual. They can also be influenced by environmental temperature, and every animal has a critical temperature where they start burning more energy above and below this range in their comfort zone. The lower critical temperature can be different for different individuals depending on where they have grown up or live. I imagine that horses in Canada most likely have lower critical temperatures than most horses in Mexico, Central and South America. High dietary energy intake can increase the growth rate, but just up to the genetic potential of the individual. When too much energy is supplied, then excess is stored as adipose. And along with this comes some additional, additional consequences of heightened excitability and skeletal abnormalities. Factors that slow growth are changes in ambient temperature, especially above and below the horse's critical temperature. Weaning stress can slow growth as well as psychological stressors and decrease in dietary energy. The problem with some of the undesirable slowing of growth is that there can be a compensatory growth spurt following this. We see this when horses transition from colder temperatures in winter with preserved forages and then the warmer weather in spring and rich pastures. When the dietary energy restrictions are short term, as in changes of season, then compensatory growth can result. But if the energy restriction is too long term, then it will affect the ability of the horse to exhibit compensatory growth and result in a stunting of growth. A bit about the protein requirement. it is higher in the growing horse than the adult horse because the individual is using protein to build body tissues like bone and muscle. When too much protein is fed, the horse will not keep growing. It will just get fatter because the protein will be broken down and part of it used as energy. In the growing horse, the amino acid content of the proteins are as important as the total amount of protein. The amino acids that are limiting for growth are lysine and possibly threonine. If there isn't enough, then horses won't grow properly. In an experiment with weanlings fed 9% crude protein with lysine and threonine, the foals grew better than the control weanlings getting a 14% crude protein. Other amino acids that we know are important for bone and cartilage are glycine, proline, and hydroxyproline, and none of these which are limiting that we know of in the horse. And as stated previously, if there are not enough other nutrients, then additional amino acids can't increase the growth rate. So where do we find protein? Well, besides the protein found in forages, high quality proteins can be found in milk proteins such as whey, soybean products, legumes like alfalfa, and clover. There is protein in almost all of these stuffs consumed by horses except oils, but not in the high quality of these mentioned. Lower quality, but still useful proteins used in horse feeds are distillers, cottonseed meal, and cereal grains. Feeding too much protein at one time can affect the bioavailability. So instead of feeding the protein in one meal, spread it out into smaller, more frequent meals. This gives a more near constant supply of amino acids and mimics natural feeding behavior. As we saw in the NRC table, mineral and vitamin requirements increase with growth. Vitamin A is one that is very important in growth and not usually a problem if the foal is consuming adequate green forage, but can be an issue when feeding conserved forages like hay, especially those that have lost color and spend more time in storage. Vitamin D is very important in bone metabolism, but it's easily accessed when the horse is exposed to sunlight. It's not normally an issue unless the foal is confined to a dark stall for long periods of time. Vitamin E is very important for immune function and may need to be supplemented if a foal is fed preserved forages and low selenium. So minerals are very important structural component as constructional components of the skeleton. Over 90% of the calcium and phosphorus and 80% of the magnesium deposited in the fetus during the last trimester of pregnancy. So there needs to be adequate calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium in the diet of the mare. It is not only a question of amounts, but also the ratio of some minerals in relation to others. The two very important ratios we look at in horses are crude protein, the max being around 3:1, and of calcium to phosphorus. And then zinc and copper that should remain between 3:1, 5:1 of zinc to copper. Copper supplementation in the last trimester of gestation of the mare was found to reduce the incidence of myositis and OCD in foals, regardless of whether the foal got supplemental copper while it was nursing. Zinc and manganese have roles in skeletal development. Selenium is needed for immune function. Iodine is important in metabolism and deficiency or toxicity resulting in goiter. Silicon may improve skeletal development and then rations that can be overfortified when there is inappropriate mix of forages, feeds, and supplements. The feedstuffs we feed to horses are either forages or other feedstuffs. There are many different types of roughages and other different types of feedstuffs that we use in horses. But what we would consider high quality means that it has to have a higher level of protein and or energy. An example of like alfalfa being a higher quality roughage because it's higher in protein and higher in energy than grass hays. Another example of a high quality feedstuff would be soybeans, whether it's a meal or extruded, because soybean has a high amino acid content and especially high levels of lysine, as well as the other amino acids, making it a better protein source. I just wanted to put a word in here about commercial concentrates because they are the most commonly used feedstuff in growing horses next to forages. They are used to complement the shortcomings of a forage. They are formulated for a specific type of horse, whether it's a performance horse or something like a breeding and growing feed. They can be formulated with different combinations of energy sources, and then with added protein and vitamins and minerals. These different combinations of energy sources will are done to suit the demands of different types of horses. Within each of these types of feeds, you might be able to find some that are higher or lower in starch, or some higher or lower in fat and fiber. I think someone may be getting into this topic further along in the day, but I'll suffice here to say that research may be pointing us into the direction of the use of lower starch and higher fat and fiber feeds as a more appropriate choice for the growing horse. I'd like to take a minute also to talk about a specific type of concentrate feed, because it's going to come up frequently in my feeding recommendations. So the ration balancer is a low intake feed used to balance out what's missing in the forage without adding too many calories. It can be fed alone with forage as a low intake feed, or it can be used when feeding straight cereal grains to make a homemade concentrate and balance out what's missing in the oats or barley and the forage. Or it can be a top-off for a diet when a commercial feed is being fed lower than the recommended feeding rate. For the majority of growing horses, unless they are in show or sales prep or something like that, where higher growth rates may be more desirable, a ration balancer can be quite adequate if the foal is getting good quality forage or pasture, because it balances out what is missing or low in the forage, whether that's protein, vitamins, or minerals, without adding too many calories. So looking a little bit more specifically at the diets of these animals, the pre-weanling foal can spend up to 73% of the day eating solid food. And then we see with this weanling that milk production, as milk production drops off dramatically after 3 to 4 months of lactation, the foal is having to make up with the deficit with solid foods. With high quality forage available, it may not be necessary for the additional energy, but there are some advantages to supplementing a foal's diet with a concentrate. If the foals are accustomed to eating some type of concentrate before they're weaned, they may experience less stress and weight loss from weaning. It's been considered safe to feed up to half a kilo of feed per month of age for the average size horse, if needed for weight without issues. But in light of recent research, it may be prudent to feed something that is designed for foals, but is higher in fiber and fat and lower in starch than conventional formulations. So creep feeding can be advantageous in circumstances like when there's a question of whether the dam is producing enough milk, or the foal is not growing as well as it should be, or as I said, to adapt to a post-weaning diet. So I promised to Elias to do a very brief synopsis of weaning methods. Weaning is one of the most stressful periods in a foal's life. It's not just the physical nourishment that the dam provides the foal with, but also emotional security. The stress of weaning predisposes the weanling to disease, injury, and reduced growth rates. The primary concern at this time of weaning is the reduction of stress. Certain preventative measures are prudent before weaning, such as deworming and vaccinations, starting the foal on creep feed, handling the foal to accustom it to human contact, making sure the facilities are safe for weaning, such as good fencing with no dangerous objects, and the right kind of fencing for the partial weaning method. Lastly, reducing or omitting the mare's ration 1 week prior to weaning will reduce milk production. So just some of the research, synopsis of some of the research done on weaning. We have seen that abrupt weaning can be done in many different ways, such as putting foals in stalls or removing the foal or the mare from the pasture or pen. Some of the research on weaning have found methods that were less stressful and resulted in less aggression. And I'll go through some of these briefly, but there are many references on what are the best weaning methods available. When foals are removed from the mare and put in stalls, either alone or in pairs, it was observed that the foals in pairs were more stressed than those by themselves. When foals were accustomed to getting a concentrate, then they experienced less stress and weight loss than those unaccustomed to it. It was observed that when foals were put into stalls with their dams for 7 to 10 days and then the dam removed, the foals were less stressed because they were in a familiar environment. When comparing whether it's best to remove the mare or the foal, it was seen that it was less stressful for the foal when it remains in the familiar environment. When groups of foals were abruptly weaned, it produced less stress in them than if they had an unrelated adult with them when they were without adult supervision. Partial weaning by keeping the foal and dam in adjoining pens, but where the foal can't nurse, was less stressful than total separation. Perhaps the best method we found at the Mare Center was gradual separation, with which we removed one dam at a time out of a pasture with a group of mares and foals. It was important to get the removed mare as far as possible out of earshot. The weanling period up to 12 months of age is the most critical for the risk of development of orthopedic diseases because it's the period when the skeleton is the most vulnerable to disease. This is the period when monitoring growth rates can be really helpful in preventing development of orthopedic diseases. Nutrition can play a role in the development of diseases in the way of deficiencies or excesses, as well as imbalances of nutrients. There can be a noticeable slump in growth rate after weaning if the foal experiences a lot of stress. Careful management through this time can smooth out the growth curve. Another time we see a slump in growth is the ending of the winter months, particularly in colder climates, and then a compensatory growth as the spring grass comes on. While this is a typical occurrence, it can be moderated by making sure the foals are on a higher plane of nutrition through the winter months by feeding them higher quality hay and a concentrate. So here is a graph of over 25,000 data points that we've gathered from thoroughbred farms over the 30 years that we've been collecting data at KER. And as you can see, the average daily gain decreases steadily for about 10 to 11 months. And then in some countries, there is a slight increase that coincides with the onset of the spring flush of grass. It's interesting that we don't see this with the Indian foals here, and that's because of the different type of climate that these foals are raised in. Another issue that predisposes growing horses to developmental orthopedic diseases is fluctuation in growth rates, where there is a slowing of growth followed by a growth spurt. These are common with the fluctuations in weather-related temperatures or stressful periods of weaning, injury, or even disease. Foals with a steady, slow growth rate tend to be less vulnerable to irregular growth rates. So this type of growth pattern is recommended for any foals that are not expected to be sold as yearlings or need to meet breed demands for growth. Interestingly, if rapid growth can be delayed until after the window of vulnerability for bone and joint disease at about 1 year of age passes, then the risk of developing growth-related developmental orthopedic diseases decreases. So a good basic strategy for feeding the foal, the weanling foal, is to supply it with good quality forage and a concentrate that's been formulated for foals, or a ration balancer with adequate supplies of vitamins and minerals and sufficient quality protein. You want to monitor growth carefully. Don't let them get too fat or too thin. Cut their calories if it's growing too fast, and add more calories if it's not growing fast enough. And plenty of exercise is important for building strong, resilient bones. So try not to confine the horses for more than 10 hours a day. There may be different scenarios depending on the end goal for the foal. So if slow, steady growth is desired for horses, they're not going to sales or futurities, then feeding high quality forage with just a ration balancer may be all that's needed to have a balanced diet. If good quality forage is not available, then it makes a quality concentrate feed formulated for growing horses even more important. If the foal is in preparation for sales or shows, then quality forage is essential, and topping it off with a feed formulated for growing horses. Or a cereal grain and a ration balancer would be appropriate. If more energy is needed or more shine to the coat, then adding something like bee pulp or vegetable oil or rice bran can be added to the diet. So going on to feeding the yearling, the yearlings have passed that window of opportunity for the development of orthopedic diseases and are less likely to develop them at this time. But that's not to say that it can't happen. If something shows up in the yearling, it's likely it formed during the first year of life before manifesting itself. Monitoring growth rates is still important at this time. And a correct balance in the diet is key, and managing nutrition will be important, especially if some of these, some clinical developmental orthopedic diseases do show up. Interestingly enough, colts may need more calories than fillies, especially if they're still intact. Good spring grass can provide ample calories, but can push a horse to grow fast, and sometimes too fast. And this is fine for horses in sales prep, but it may have to be limited if faster growth rates are not desired for the individual. And then you could also cut out the concentrate or switch the horse to a ration balancer instead of limiting access to pasture. For sales and show prep horses, be sure to keep quality forage available and some type of concentrate formulated for the growing horse, which can also be topped off with additional calories with things such as oil, stabilized rice bran, or bee pulp. So in summary, a good basic strategy for feeding the yearling is to supply it with plenty of good quality forage and a concentrate that's been formulated for foals with adequate supplies of vitamins and minerals and sufficient quality protein. This could be a concentrate or a ration balancer. Monitor growth carefully and don't let it get too fat or too thin. Cut calories if it's growing too fast. Switching from a concentrate to a smaller amount of ration balancer is an easy way to cut calories without sacrificing other important nutrients for sound growth. Plenty of exercise is very important for building resilient bones, so try not to confine the horse for more than 10 hours a day. There's no simple rules about how much grain is too much. Each individual feeds, so you should feed each as an individual. Forage availability and quality will dictate the grain requirement. Regularly weigh and body condition score young stock and to maintain vigilance on their growth rate. A ration evaluation can be helpful at this time if they're, and to reduce intake, look to use grass hay instead of alfalfa hay or feed a ration balancer rather than a conventional concentrate feed. So moving on to recommendations for the older horses, like 2 years old and up. While growth has slowed considerably at this time in life, we need to continue supplying these nutrients important for supporting growth. An additional factor that may come into play here that will influence the horse's energy and nutrient requirements is if they start into some type of training, such as race training. So we need not only to feed for growth, but we also need to feed for performance. If we look back at the NRC recommendations for megacals of digestible energy and protein, we would see a steady increase in both as the intensity of work increases. It's really important to treat young horses in training as individuals because there can be quite a difference between metabolism of one horse to another. So a good basic strategy for feeding the 2-year-old is to supply it with plenty of good quality forage and a concentrate that has been formulated for the growing horse, or one with a higher protein for performance horses and with adequate supplies of energy, as well as vitamins, minerals, and sufficient quality protein to meet the demands of growth and work. Monitor growth carefully and don't let them get too fat or too thin. Again, cut calories if they're growing too fast, or increase the concentrate feed, or the quality of the forage if getting too thin. Look for low starch. I mean, at this stage, I would be looking for lower starch feed alternatives. They need plenty of exercise still for building strong, resilient bones. So again, try not to keep them confined. Too much of part of the day is recommended. So the best method of diagnosing mineral and vitamin deficiencies, excesses or imbalances, is through ration evaluation. We do offer ration evaluation services through our website at KUR. And I also invite you to visit our extensive library on our website at kur.com, where you can find thousands of articles on equine nutrition management and care. You can also sign up for our newsletter, which will bring you the link to articles of interest for the time and season of the year. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention.